$800 billion in trade is hanging by a thread tonight. 400,000 American jobs could vanish in a single morning. The White House has just received a warning they never expected. Mexico is not bluffing. They are preparing a devastating counterattack. Your grocery bills are about to skyrocket if this button is pushed. General Motors and Ford are staring into an industrial abyss. The Corn Belt is panic-stricken as their biggest buyer walks away. This is not just a diplomatic spat. This is economic mutual destruction. Welcome to the most dangerous trade standoff of the decade. If you care about your wallet, you need to understand this threat. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the financial storm coming your way. Comment trade war if you think the US is ready for this fight. Let's analyze the retaliation that has Washington terrified. The sheer scale of the weaponry involved in this economic standoff is unlike anything we have seen in modern North American history, representing a caliber of financial firepower that dwarfs previous trade disputes. When we talk about the arsenal Mexico is deploying, we are not discussing military hardware or troop movements, but something far more lethal to the American heartland. A precision-guided dismantling of the agricultural and industrial supply chains that keep the United States economy afloat. President Claudia Sheinbaum has effectively placed a loaded weapon against the temple of the U.S. automotive industry, a sector that relies so heavily on cross-border parts flow that a disruption of even a few days would cost billions of dollars in lost revenue and idle factories from Michigan to Alabama. Economy Minister Marcelo Ebrard did not mince words when he laid out the ballistics of this conflict, explicitly identifying the targets that would feel the immediate pain of a 25% retaliatory tariff: the American farmer and the American auto worker. We are looking at a scenario where millions of tons of yellow corn from Iowa and Nebraska, currently destined for Mexican livestock feed, would suddenly rot in silos, creating a financial catastrophe for the very rural base that supports the incoming administration. The logistical integration between these two nations is so tight that a single vehicle part crosses the border up to 8 times during production. Severing this link is not a negotiating tactic, it is an act of industrial suicide that would hand global dominance directly to Chinese competitors. The ammunition here includes the $30 billion in agricultural products the U.S. exports to Mexico annually, a market share that took decades to build and could be wiped out in a week if Mexico turns to Brazil or Argentina for its food security. This is the reality of the Phase 1 arsenal. It is a scorched earth capability that ensures if Mexico burns, the United States burns with it, creating an inflationary inferno that would consume the savings of every working-class family in America. The detection of this threat did not come through a classified briefing or a diplomatic cable, but exploded onto the global stage through a late-night digital transmission that sent shockwaves through every financial capital from New York to Mexico City. It began with a Truth Social post, a digital flare fired by President-elect Donald Trump, threatening a blanket 25% tariff on all Mexican goods as a day-one executive order, a move ostensibly aimed at curbing fentanyl and migration but landing like a cluster bomb on the remarkably stable North American trade zone. The intelligence response from Mexico City was immediate, sophisticated, and completely devoid of the submission that Washington might have anticipated from its southern neighbor in decades past. Within hours, the Mexican Situation Room led by President Sheinbaum and her top economic generals had analyzed the threat vectors and concluded that this was an existential challenge, requiring a maximum alert posture and an immediate public counter-offensive. They identified the bluff immediately. The U.S. cannot block Mexican imports without causing a recession at home, and they used this intelligence to formulate a response that was less about defense and more about aggressive deterrence. Economy Minister Ebrard, a veteran of these diplomatic trenches, took to the airwaves, not with pleas for mercy, but with cold, hard data, projecting that the U.S. corporate sector would effectively be paying double taxes that would decimate their profit margins and force immediate layoffs. The detection phase revealed a critical weakness in the U.S. strategy: the assumption that Mexico would fold under pressure, when in reality, the Mexican government had spent months preparing a Plan B specifically designed for this exact scenario. Surveillance of the markets showed an immediate reaction. The peso wobbled, but then steadied as investors realized that Mexico's leadership was not panicking, but rather positioning itself for a protracted siege that the U.S. consumer might not have the stomach to endure. This was a failure of U.S. intelligence to understand the new political landscape in Mexico, where a stern leftist ideologue like Sheinbaum operates with a mandate of national sovereignty that precludes bowing to threats, regardless of the economic cost. The radar lit up with warnings from U.S. industry lobbyists who desperately tried to back-channel the message to the transition team that this tariff threat was a loaded gun, pointed at their own feet. As the sun rose over Mexico City on that fateful Tuesday, the atmosphere inside the National Palace was charged with the static electricity of a looming confrontation, marking the beginning of the chronologia of the clash. It is 7 a.m., and the gathered press corps can physically feel the tension in the room as President Sheinbaum approaches the podium, not with the hesitation of a junior partner, but with the steely resolve of a leader who knows she holds the leverage. She reads a diplomatic document that will be studied by historians that explicitly rejects the premise of the U.S. threat, stating unequivocally that one tariff will be followed by another, a phrase that effectively declares a trade war. By 9:30 a.m., the shockwaves hit Wall Street. Traders are frantically selling off shares of automakers like GM and Ford, realizing that their supply chains are about to be turned into a chaotic nightmare of customs delays and 25% surcharges. In the American Midwest, the sensory experience is one of dread. Farmers checking their futures contracts see the prices of corn and soy trembling, knowing that Mexico is their #1 customer for corn and that losing this market would mean foreclosure for thousands of family farms. Midday brings a cacophony of panicked phone calls from Detroit to Washington. CEOs are screaming that their just-in-time inventory systems cannot survive a 25% tariff, that their assembly lines will grind to a halt within days, silencing the hum of American manufacturing. The timeline accelerates as Eberhard takes the microphone, his voice calm but his words devastating, outlining the 400,000 jobs figure, a number that lands like a punch to the gut of the U.S. labor market, stripping away the America First veneer of the tariff threat. Then comes the phone call, the direct line between Sheinbaum and Trump, a conversation shrouded in the mystery of conflicting narratives, where the sensory details of the exchange are lost in translation, but the outcome is clear: a temporary, fragile truce built on shaky ground. Trump tweets victory, claiming the border is closed, while Sheinbaum tweets reality, asserting that bridges are being built, not walls, creating a cognitive dissonance that leaves the markets in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The sun sets on a continent held hostage by uncertainty. The immediate threat of a day one apocalypse may have been paused, but the machinery of retaliation remains primed. The target lists are still on the desks, and the finger is still hovering over the launch button. The dust settles on a landscape that has been fundamentally altered. The status quo of the USMCA has been shattered, replaced by a new reality where trade is weaponized and every shipment of avocados or auto parts is a potential hostage. The saldo of this confrontation is a stark realization for the United States. The days of dictating terms to Mexico are over, replaced by a cold, hard negotiation between equals who both possess the power to inflict severe pain. The strategic message that emerges from the smoke is that Mexico has successfully identified the U.S. economy's pressure points, inflation, and the cost of living, and is willing to press on them until the American voter screams. We are looking at a future where the price of a pickup truck in Texas rises by $3,000 overnight, where a taco in Los Angeles costs double, and where the intricate web of North American commerce is torn apart by political posturing. The law and order message here is not about border security, but about economic reality. You cannot wage war on your third-largest trading partner without wounding yourself, and in this case, the wound would be a self-inflicted gunshot to the femoral artery of the U.S. manufacturing sector. Mexico's strategic victory lies in exposing the bluff. They demonstrated that while the U.S. is the bigger market, Mexico is the essential cog that keeps the American machine running, especially in the face of competition from China. The final alert is for the American people. This was a warning shot. A tracer round fired across the bow, illuminating the terrifying fact that your economic stability is tied to a relationship that is currently being doused in gasoline and played with by politicians holding matches. Analysts are now rewriting their forecasts for 2025, factoring in a permanent risk premium for North American trade, understanding that the trust which lubricated the gears of commerce for 30 years has been replaced by suspicion and defensive posturing. The message to the White House is clear: proceed with caution, because the retaliation is not just a threat, it is a fully armed and operational mechanism that can turn a booming economy into a recessionary wasteland in a matter of months. As we close this briefing, remember that the true cost of these tariffs will not be paid by governments, but by you at the dealership, at the supermarket, and in the job market, making this the single most critical economic story of our time. Let us dig deeper into the Phase 1 arsenal, specifically focusing on the agricultural devastation that a full-scale retaliation would unleash on the American heartland, a sector already battered by volatile weather and rising input costs. Mexico is the top export destination for U.S. corn, purchasing over $5 billion worth of the crop annually. This is not a market that can be easily replaced, as other buyers like China are already diversifying away from American sources. If Mexico imposes a 25% retaliatory tariff on U.S. yellow corn, the immediate effect would be a collapse in domestic corn prices, driving them below the cost of production and forcing a massive taxpayer-funded bailout to prevent widespread farm bankruptcies. The sensory details of this agricultural collapse would be visceral: the silence of grain elevators in Illinois, the rusting of combine harvesters in Ohio, and the for sale signs popping up on family lands that have been held for generations. But the arsenal extends beyond corn. Mexico is also a massive buyer of U.S. dairy, pork, and soybeans, meaning that the pain would be distributed across the entire spectrum of American agriculture, hitting both red and blue states with equal ferocity. The scenario also involves the disruption of the cold chain, the refrigerated logistics network that moves billions of dollars of perishables. Tariffs would create administrative bottlenecks that would turn fresh produce into rotting waste at the border crossings of Laredo and Otay Mesa. We must also consider the energy sector. Mexico imports vast quantities of U.S. natural gas and refined petroleum products, and a tariff war could lead Mexico to seek energy independence or alternative suppliers, cutting off a critical revenue stream for Texas and Pennsylvania. The power of fire here is economic leverage. Mexico knows that the U.S. trade deficit is a political sore point, and by targeting high-value U.S. exports, they can maximize the political damage to the White House while minimizing the impact on their own consumers. This is a game of 3D chess where Mexico is threatening to take the U.S. Queen the agricultural vote off the board, forcing the administration to reconsider whether a tough-on-the-border stance is worth losing the support of the rural coalition. The arsenal is fully stocked, the targeting computers are locked on, and the Mexican government has signaled that they are willing to pull the trigger if the U.S. dares to cross the line of economic warfare. Returning to Phase 2, the intelligence and detection capabilities of the Mexican state have proven to be surprisingly robust, utilizing a network of consular officials and business allies within the U.S. to gauge the real intent behind the threats. The Mexican diplomatic corps in Washington has been on high alert for months, anticipating a return of the tariff weapon and quietly building alliances with U.S. governors, chambers of commerce, and industry groups who share their opposition to trade barriers. This human intelligence network allowed President Sheinbaum to react not with panic, but with a pre-prepared script, knowing exactly which buttons to push to mobilize U.S. domestic opposition to the tariffs. Sheinbaum's team detected the bluff in the timing of the announcement coming late at night, on social media, without formal diplomatic notice, and correctly interpreted it as a negotiation tactic rather than a settled policy decision. This rapid detection allowed Mexico to seize the narrative control. Within hours, the global headlines were not about Trump's tough stance, but about Mexico's defiant retaliation and the risk of a trade war, shifting the pressure back onto the White House. The intercept here was also cultural. Sheinbaum understood that appearing weak would only invite more aggression, so she adopted a posture of dignified resistance, utilizing the language of sovereignty and equality to rally. Her own domestic base, sensory descriptions of the National Palace during this phase paint a picture of focused intensity, strategy maps spread out on mahogany tables, secure lines buzzing with calls to Ottawa and Beijing, and the distinct absence of the chaotic scrambling that characterized previous administrations. The detection phase also involved a deep dive into legal frameworks. Mexico's lawyers were quick to point out that the tariffs would be a flagrant violation of the USMCA, giving them the legal high ground in any future arbitration or international court battle. They also detected the anxiety of U.S. investors. By maintaining a calm, rule-of-law approach, Mexico positioned itself as the adult in the room, contrasting sharply with the unpredictable policy swings emanating from Mar-a-Lago. The intelligence gathered in these crucial hours confirmed one thing: the U.S. was not prepared for a full-scale trade war, and this knowledge gave Mexico the confidence to double down on their retaliatory threats. In Phase 3, the confrontation, we must zoom in on the sensory experience of the border itself, the physical front line where this economic war would be fought, impacting the lives of millions who live in the binational zone. Imagine the chaos at the World Trade Bridge in Laredo, where 16,000 trucks cross daily. A 25% tariff would mean customs brokers frantically recalculating duties, drivers stranded for days in sweltering heat, and a logistical gridlock that would back up traffic for miles into both countries. The sound of this confrontation is the screeching of brakes on the supply chain. It is the silence of assembly lines in Detroit waiting for a harness that is stuck in Chihuahua, and the angry shouts of business owners watching their margins evaporate. We witnessed a minute-by-minute escalation in the rhetoric. Every hour brought a new statement, a new tweet, a new analysis, creating a fog of war where the truth was obscured by political posturing and market speculation. The confrontation was also personal. Sheinbaum, a scientist by training, versus Trump, a branding mogul. A clash of styles and substances that added a layer of unpredictable human drama to the dry economics of tariffs and trade balances. The panic of the opponent in this case, the U.S. business community, was palpable. Lobbying firms in K Street were overwhelmed with calls from clients begging them to stop the tariffs, creating a localized pressure cooker within the Beltway. Meanwhile, the precision of the Mexican response was surgical. They didn't threaten to burn down the house, they threatened to cut the power lines, specifically the lines that power the U.S. auto industry and the U.S. food supply. The impact of the ammunition was psychological. Just the threat of tariffs caused businesses to freeze hiring and delay investments, creating a shadow recession before a single dollar of duty was even collected. This chronological narrative reveals that while the initial exchange was rhetorical, the underlying currents were shifting real capital, real jobs, and real risks, proving that words from the White House have the power to destroy wealth in real time. The confrontation ended for now with a phone call, but the silence that followed is heavy with the weight of unresolved issues. A cold peace that feels more like a pause to reload than a permanent ceasefire.